Hello, I'm the world famous puzzle loving cat called Maurice. And here is another one of my world famous puzzles for you to solve. Some of my puzzles are maths puzzles, but this one is a tricky logic puzzle that involves three of my friends. My assistant will first of all explain the problem and then invite you to pause the video to solve the problem yourself. If you can't solve the problem yourself, then I will give you a little clue. If you can't solve the problem after the clue, then you must be rubbish at solving puzzles. After all, I'm a cat and I solved it without a clue. So here is my assistant to walk you through the puzzle. Thank you, Maurice. It's a pleasure working with the world-famous puzzle-loving cat. This puzzle is easy to explain, but may be difficult to solve. Maurice has three friends, Mr Carpenter, Mr Mason and Mr Painter, who are each engaged in different occupations. By a strange coincidence, one is a carpenter, one is a mason and one is a painter. But their names do not necessarily match their occupations. Assuming that only one of the following statements is true, can you deduce who does what? Mr Carpenter is not a painter. Mr Mason is not a carpenter. Mr Carpenter is a carpenter. Mr Mason is not a painter. So that's the problem. Can you work out who does what? So that's the problem. Can you work out who does what? For those of you who have seen my puzzles before, this is where I invite you to pause the video to work it out for yourself. If you don't pause the video, I'm going to give you a little clue to help you get started. But if you like to do puzzles like me, then you won't need the clue. Here is the clue. It's just a little hint to get you started. Only one of the statements is true. Look at statements number 1 and number 3. If the statement number 3, Mr Carpenter is a carpenter, is true, then the statement number 1, Mr Carpenter is not a painter, is also true. But the rules of the puzzle says that there can only be one true statement. So at least one of these statements must be false. Which one can we say with certainty is false? That's the clue to this puzzle. I'll now invite you to pause the video to solve the rest of the puzzle before asking my assistant to walk through the rest. I can't be bothered and I'm feeling rather sleepy, and he is more patient than me. Thank you, Maurice. To recap, we looked at statements 1 and 3, and by the rules of the game, both of them cannot be true. So statement 3 must be false, because if it is true, then statement 1 is also true. And at this stage, we cannot say precisely whether statement 1, Mr Carpenter is not a painter, is true or false. It can be either. So, we now know that statement 3, Mr Carpenter is a carpenter, is false, which tells us that Mr Carpenter's profession is either a painter or a mason. We will just put this to one side at the moment. Let's now look at statements 1 and 4. Mr Carpenter is not a painter and Mr Mason is not a painter. If you think about it, then both these statements can't be both false. If they were both false, then that would mean that Mr Carpenter is a painter and Mr Mason is a painter. So one of these two statements must be true, but we don't know which one it is at the moment. Are you with us so far? If not, then just rewind and run through this again. The next thing we can deduce is that since either statements 1 or 4 is true, and the rules of the puzzle say that only one statement is true, then the statement number 2, Mr Mason is not a carpenter, must be false. There is only one true statement. So, since the statement number 2, Mr Mason is not a carpenter, is a false statement, then that means that Mr Mason is a carpenter, and hence the statement number 4, Mr Mason is not a painter, is the true one. Finally, this means that Mr Mason is a carpenter, Mr Carpenter is a mason, and Mr Painter is a painter. Well, that's the end of the puzzle. Did you do that all on your own, or did you cheat? If you did it all by yourself, then well done. Look out for more of Maurice's favourite puzzles. They're on the YouTube somewhere. Bye.